where I am on the West Coast, or whether you are on the East Coast, where some of our guests are, or anywhere in between. It's always good to be able to come together and hold space and build community with folks who are concerned about issues tied to educational equity in our schools. And I am honored and pleased to have a very distinguished group of panelists, and I look forward to the discussion with them today. I also want to thank the amazing support team I have at the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools, Geneva Sum, Caitlin McAloon, and have all been phenomenal in doing this work. I also want to thank the folks from Corwin who are the publisher of this book, and I want to just give a little bit of background in terms of how and why this book came together. But I want to try to be clear that the goal is not to keep the book at the 30,000-foot level, but to be able to make the book real and accessible by hearing from folks who are what I call in the trenches every single day. And that's why we have our distinguished panel here. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So why this book and why equity now? I think its timing is really connected to the fact that in 2 days, on May the 17th, we will be celebrating or recognizing, because some would say it's not a celebration, but recognizing the 70-year anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. And in many circles, Brown versus Board of Education was supposedly seen as a breakthrough to make sure we created more equitable schools. It was seen as a breakthrough to ensure we would have greater racial equality in schools. And it was a breakthrough, hopefully, that we saw schools as being a forebear to what would happen in the wider society. The idea that separating children in public schools based on race being ruled unconstitutional, we hope that it signaled the end of the segregation of schools in the United States. Needless to say, in many ways now, with hindsight of 7 decades in our rearview mirror, that has not happened. And so part of why this book was written was that we need to perhaps think about a different model, use a different approach, ask different questions, think about different policies, or utilize different practices that help us to really achieve that goal of equality. And part of what I really struggle with in this particular work is that perhaps equality should not have been our goal and aim, and perhaps equity should be what our focus was. So again, Brown is the framing here, 70 years almost to the day that it was ruled unconstitutional to have schools being separate but unequal. But yet we look at a lot of our outcomes, and it begs the question, was Brown successful? And I think we'll get into that with our panelists momentarily. Next slide, please. So to anchor this work, I want to bring us back to 3 core principles that are really sort of the core, sort of what I call pillars of this work when I think about what equity now looks like and what it means, and trying to use different ways of how we think about this, how we understand it, how we think about this within our teaching, within our policies and our practices. It's really thinking about equity now tied to these 3 anchors: justice, which really is around the idea of doing what's right, recognizing the humanity in all of our students, not withholding opportunities from students because of their identities, because of their socioeconomic status, because of their language, their place of origin. But justice is about how do we create the kinds of schools that are anchored around love and caring, and seeing what is right in terms of the basic needs being met of all students. And we still here in 2024 are, I think, in the pursuit of justice to ensure that every student who walks into a school in this country is seen as an equal and given everything that they are needed in order to be successful. But I maintain that in order to achieve justice, we have to get to that second pillar, which is recognizing and repairing past harms. And I think that's where equality has fallen short, and that equality has fallen short because it is not understood that there have been groups in this country who have historically been left behind, who have historically been not given the opportunities. And so we can't assume that we just can pick up the pieces as if we all had the same starting place. I would argue that if we're going to do equity now, it has to be in line with what Gloria Ladson-Billings calls the education debt, to recognize that what has happened to indigenous populations, to enslaved Africans, to folks of Latin descent, folks of Asian descent, is really centered on a framework of white supremacy that has denied opportunity, that has denied equality. So until we recognize those past harms, until we take steps to repairing those past harms, we're not going to ever achieve equality. I've always maintained that equality should be our goal. Equity is our pathway to get there. And so what does that mean? I think this is where it gets scary for some folks, but I think if you're going to do equity work, it asks us to be very intentional, bold, and unapologetic, to give more time, more effort, more resources to those groups that have historically been excluded in order for them to be able to be self-actualized. And once we do that, that's what justice is tied to. And then that final pillar is around belonging. How do we create the schools that are centered around belonging and inclusion, and it recognizes and sees students for all of their many identities, understands the different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking, different ways of processing that we know are so endemic to the brilliant students that we serve in this country every single day. So part of what we have to think about if we're going to do equity work in a more robust and I think a more transformative way, it's making sure that justice is at the center. It's also tied to recognizing and repairing past harms, but it also seeks to create belonging schools. And I mentioned belonging because some folks think that if you want to do equity, it means to give to some groups, you have to take from others. Again, I borrow from Heather McGee, who said this is not a zero-sum game. When you help those who have historically been on the margins, on the outside looking in, others don't lose. If you help those who have historically been outside seeking the same opportunities, the same advantages that those who have had them for centuries, they don't lose. I maintain that rising tides lifts all boats, and we help those who have historically been marginalized, everyone wins. So that's the framework that guides this work on equity, and we'll come back to that as we have the conversation with our panelists. Next slide, please. So I just want to kind of walk you through just some of the key highlights of the book so we can move on to our panel, our panelists. You'll see in the first chapter of the book, it calls, I make a call for why equity now, why equity is different from equality, as I mentioned just a moment ago. I maintain that equality says give everyone the same thing, and I maintain that we are so unequal as a society when it comes to school. If we give everyone the same thing, we'll still have deep-seated inequality. So we have to unpack equality and make the case for equity. I also maintain that we need to have all hands on deck. So I wrote this book with a focus on everyone who's concerned with schools: leaders, teachers, parents, caregivers, data folks, policymakers, students, whoever you are. If you're concerned about schools, there's a place in this book that I think you will find a discussion that moves someone to action. But there's a very key focus on racial, ethnic dynamics that are a part of our schools in so many ways. There's a focus on students with disability who continue to be overlooked and underserved, in my humble opinion. There's a focus on where we are with language learners, which is a growing population in our schools. We have close to 10 million students in this country who live in households where English is not the first language that's spoken. So we have to be mindful of language diversity and why it matters. There's also a conversation about poverty, because again, we have over 14 million young people in schools across this country who live in poverty, and we have to understand why we have to do something different if we're going to help those who are on the economic fringes. And I also sort of situate this conversation around equity in the current political movement. The current political movement where there are attacks on DEI, attacks on critical race theory, this whole notion around wokeness. There's a concerted effort by banning books, by eradicating anything that mentions diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wanted to be very intentional because some folks said, well, maybe you don't mention equity in this title because folks will attack it. Well, that was the very reason why I wanted it to be in the title, because I want to invite that conversation. I want to invite those attacks because we can't let folks take our language. We can't let folks take away our aims and objectives. If equity is what we want, we should be bold and we should fight for it and defend it as long as we can. So you cannot dissect, or you cannot separate all these issues tied to race and language and ability and socioeconomic status and even gender equity. You can't separate them from this current political movement that is quite divisive and in many ways taking us back to a darker, even more oppressive day. Next slide, please. You'll see in each of the chapters, there are questions I use for consideration because I want this work to be seen as a tool for us to have small learning communities, to get into deep discussions, whether at your school, in a community setting, to ask whether or not we can begin to understand how we move forward. This book was also written at a time that was really on the heels of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And part of what the pandemic exposed, as we all know, was just the ways in which deep-seated inequities became even more exposed during the pandemic. We're still dealing with the effects of the pandemic. In some districts and states across this country, chronic absenteeism is close to 50%. We're having to rethink schools in some significant ways now because young people are saying, why do I need to be at school every day when I can do my schoolwork from home in a much more efficient way? So we're having to ask different kinds of questions. Then we also have to think about the role of mental health, because what we learned from the pandemic is that we took young people out of schools. We disconnected them from peers. We disconnected them from loving adults, their teachers, their mentors. And the damage that we might see from that could be something we face for years to come. So we have to demystify the conversation on mental health. And in the book, I offer a number of resources that we can talk about. And I also lift up the concept of community schools, where many districts are moving now, is to say we need to have holistic approaches where we have all the resources in one place: academic supports, mental health supports, and the whole 9 yards, helping with job training, helping with medical supports, vision, dental, you name it, because schools have to begin to think about doing something different in this current moment. My grandmother always told me the surest sign that you're insane is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And I think in schools, we do that a lot. We keep doing the same thing over and over again, and then we scratch our heads and wonder why things have not changed. I'm hoping we can do something different. Next slide, please. I also lift up in this book the importance of us. If we're going to do equity, we can't use a one size fits all approach. And why do I mention that? Because I think we oftentimes don't take into account the fact that if we're going to be equity focused, we're going to be equity centered, we have to put a focus on our most vulnerable populations. And we need to name who those populations are. In many districts across the country, they're Black students. In many districts across the country, they're brown students. Sometimes those students are experiencing food insecurities. Many of those students oftentimes experience time in foster care. Many of those students are unhoused. We have to understand that for some of our students, just showing up at schools is a huge accomplishment in and of itself, given some of the outside factors that they deal with and contend with. And so people say, well, doesn't that speak to their resilience? And I always say, yeah, I think we have to have a conversation about resilience, because, yeah, resilience is great, but students should not have to be resilient all the time. Students should not have to always be fighters every day. Students should not have to show resiliency every single day just to be children. Why don't we change the structures, the policies, and the practices in such a way so that young people don't have to be resilient every single day? So part of this is how we begin to recognize the challenges that young people face every single day and how schools can respond, and begin to ask a different question: not why are students failing, but why are schools failing in their teaching and learning of their students? And I think that's what Equity Now seeks to do, is to begin to ask a different question, where we think about issues around school culture, our most vulnerable youth. And I also lift up this topic of hate speech, which, as I spend more time in schools, I hear it more and more than I would care to hear. If I walk into another school where Black students talk about how much the N word is used by non-Black students in their presence without any kind of disruption, admonishing, discipline, or disruption of that, I will scream. I think we have to recognize that language matters, and many of our young people are being harmed by hate speech that's being so commonplace in our schools. Next slide. In chapter 4, I really want to give folks who are in this work from a leadership standpoint some framing. I asked my school leaders, my school board members, my principals, teacher leaders, coaches, to begin to think about, how do we think about our curriculum? How does our curriculum begin to reflect the students that we serve? Two of the folks who are on this panel, I think, are experts at this, because I've watched Mr. Luke work for years, if not longer, fighting to ensure that these efforts are not just one-offs, but how do we begin to embody a school culture, a district culture that begins to recognize the ways in which we incorporate culture and language and race to what students learn and listen to every single day. Miss Anderson is here. I walked into Miss Anderson's classroom in Philadelphia. It just shouts culturally responsive teaching all around it. I'm not going to steal her thunder. I'll let her talk about it in a minute. But the goal is to recognize that we can do better at the school level, even in this current moment, but it requires an intentionality behind this focus. Next slide, please. Chapter 5, again, is about what teachers can do in the classroom. Part of what we have to do is that, yes, it helps if the district is on board. It helps if our district policies are on board. But in this moment, and this political sort of fragility that we're seeing around issues tied to diversity, equity, inclusion, part of what I ask teachers to do is to recognize that even if the forces of your district or your school are not behind you, you still have lots of autonomy and power in your own classrooms. And you don't have to wait for permission to do certain things. You just do it until you're told you cannot do it. And this is why I have so much admiration and respect for teachers who say, listen, I'm going to make sure that my curriculum reflects my students. When you walk into my classroom, my walls reflect my students. The conversations are tied to what they see, feel, and hear every single day. And part of what I also say in this chapter, I talk about moving beyond self-care. And part of what I raise in this chapter, which is important, is that we tell teachers all the time, you have to engage in self-care. You have to practice self-care. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. And I'm saying we need to stop telling teachers to have to engage in so much self-care. Why don't we remove all the barriers and all the policies and all the bureaucracy that requires teachers to have so much self-care in the first place? If you take away some of the minutia that's involved in education, I may not have to have self-care. If you have more responsive policies, I may not have to have self-care. If I had smaller class sizes, I may not have to have so much self-care. If I didn't have to deal with really mind-numbing assessments, I may not have to have so much self-care. If I had more support from my administrators, I may not have to have so much self-care. So let's remove the barriers that require teachers to have so much self-care in the first place, and then we can begin to see teachers do even more amazing things. And you see here some of the questions for consideration about what teachers should be doing. We ask teachers to do a lot of reflection. I always say the more reflective I am, the more effective I am. And so we ask teachers to think through some reflection steps in this chapter 5 that I think are important to think about moving equity to the classroom space. 2 more chapters I'll talk about real quick, and then we'll open it up for our panel. Chapter 6 is one of my favorite ones because it talks about how we have to think about engaging our parents and caregivers in this discussion around equity. And I say it in a way that does not point fingers. I say it in a way that does not play the blame game, but I ask us to be more thoughtful about why is it that parents and caregivers don't engage in schools in the first place. For many of those folks who don't show up at schools, they see schools as a scene of the crime. It's the place that they remember years ago that was harmful to them. It's the place that they recall as decades ago was very hurtful to them. It was a place that did not see them, did not affirm them, did not create the kind of spaces that allowed them to be their best self. So for many parents and caregivers, schools are seen as hostile spaces. So we have to think about how we create schools that sees our parents and caregivers. And I use caregivers intentionally because I want us to be mindful that not all children are being raised by their biological parents. We have over 2.5 million young people in this country who are being raised by grandparents. Then we have close to 500,000 students who are being raised by foster parents. The number of our young people who are being raised by aunts, uncles, extended family members. We have to have a real understanding of family diversity and begin to recognize that schools will be better. Schools will be more supportive and more equity-minded when we begin to build relational trust with our parents and caregivers. There's a reason why parents show up at schools angry. There's a reason why parents oftentimes show up at schools upset and frustrated. And we have to be willing to sit in that discomfort, that uncomfortable place to understand we have to do better because parents need and want something different. I also lift up the fact that when we looked at what happened over the past couple of years with school board protests, we had folks who showed up at school boards in droves across this country because they thought that critical race theory was taking over the schools. Despite the fact that there was no data to show that critical race theory was even being taught in schools, school boards moved to the point of enacting state legislators to put in laws that ban the teaching of critical race theory, even though it was not being taught. It moved some state legislators to begin to say, you can't even talk about race. You can't talk about ethnicity in certain states. In the state of Tennessee, that they have even said you can be fined up to $1 million if you teach certain aspects of slavery that they do not approve. So when parents show up and they're vocal and they're visible and they're persistent, transformation of schools can happen in no time flat. And I offer some strategies of what we can do to make sure we see our parents and caregivers as partners and not as adversaries. And the final chapter, chapter 7, which is around data and equity. Again, one of my favorite chapters in this book, because I ask us to think about data in a much more critical fashion. We live in an information age. There's lots of data at our fingertips, but I ask us to think about what data should we be collecting and what data are we ignoring? Because I think that we think of data only as being quantitative data, test scores, grades, graduation rates. Those are all important data points, don't get me wrong. But I think there are other data points that we have to think about as well. When students choose not to show up in schools, that's a data point. When certain students are disengaged in a classroom, that's a data point. When students cuss out a teacher for a reason, that's a data point. When parents show up and they're angry at something, that's a data point. There are data points all around us that I ask us to think about and not only focus on formal assessments and formal data, but there are lots of other types of data that are also telling us a story that we should be listening to. I also make a call to say we should be thinking about how our data is disaggregated by race and ethnicity and gender, because in many instances, what we know is that we see schools say we're doing great, but then you do a deeper dive at their Black students, at their brown students, we see that the outcomes look far different. They say we're doing great, but then you do a closer look at their SPED students, you see, the data is not so great. We have to have disaggregated data that begins to look at students who are language learners, students who are in foster care, students who are experiencing housing securities. I said we have to have a much harder conversation, a much longer conversation, a much more critical conversation about the ways in which we see data not being used in ways that helps us with our most vulnerable populations as it pertains to issues tied to equity. I could also spend the next half an hour talking about data on school suspensions, which is a big, big topic, right? Black children are more likely to be suspended than any other group of students. I hear superintendents say, look at our data, Dr. Howard, our data on suspensions has gone down, but the devil is always in the details. Out of school suspensions have gone down in districts across the country, but guess what has gone up? In-school suspensions have gone through the roof, and in-school suspensions, in my humble opinion, folks, are a hot mess. It's just high-profile daycare. So anyway, I could go on and on and on. So that's the overview of the book. Again, questions for each particular chapter that can be used for further discussion at your school or at your district. I also have the equity framework of the 3 pillars of justice, repair, and belonging to give examples of what they look like. But I want to hear from the real experts now. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I want to begin to see if we can bring in our experts. And I want to ask the first question to, I'll go with Ms. Anderson, who's joining us from Philadelphia. When you think equity in schools, what does it mean to you, and what are the obstacles to achieving equity in schools, Ms. Anderson?
Well, first, thank you for having me be a part of this very important conversation. Equity for me is basic, is every child getting what they need. We're having this conversation right now with my 10th grade, and Kai is experiencing it currently. We're having this conversation because in 10th grade, we're critiquing the educational system in America and how, the education of Black people in America. And so we're going into our debate right now, like quality education as a constitutional right, right? And how just the 14th Amendment and protections for education is not enough. It needs to be quality. And so we had to define what quality is, right? So equity is everyone getting what they need so that they can have access in an educational space. So that could mean emotional support. That could mean mental health. That could mean someone just needs to give them a hug every day and identify and recognize their humanity. So it's whatever it is. Some of the obstacles to equity are selfishness and bias and dislike. Sometimes children are in these schools and don't feel like anyone likes them. Because when children come into this educational space, when they walk into a building, a lot of times people don't even say hello. They're always barking orders. Do you have your ID? Did you do your homework? Sit down, look at the board. But what about the humanity? Good morning. You look nice today. Oh, you got your hair cut. You sharp. Like that goes a long way. If children know that you genuinely care about them, that makes the difference. That's a human thing. So equity is everyone getting what they need in order so that they can thrive. And barriers to that are the things, like I said, selfishness, biases, prejudices, all of those things.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. And again, I got to shout you out. You know why I had to invite you on here, because I walked into your classroom and it just screamed of equity and concern and care and love. And so I so appreciate when you talk about those obstacles being greed and people just not doing some of the smaller things, which I saw you do in terms of how you greet students at the door and how you have this love that emanates from what you do. So I want to thank you for sharing that. Let's go to you, Mr. Luke. You're an administrator. You spent time as a teacher, as a principal, and now as a district level administrator. What does equity mean to you, and what are some of the obstacles that you believe that get in the way of it?
Well, first of all, like Ms. Anderson stated, thank you for having me. I count it an honor and a privilege. When we talk about equity, I think it's exactly what Ms. Anderson said. And one thing in our district we add, we'll tag on to the end of that, is regardless of how it goes across racial or socioeconomic lines, because sometimes people want to have selective equity too. And so we have to also make sure that that's important. But when we talk about equity, we have to understand that there are people that don't want to call out certain groups, certain aspects of an organization, certain pieces, because for whatever reason, it doesn't make them feel good. However, the boldness and equity is the fact that you are willing to call it out. And the next thing is that you're willing to do what needs to be done, regardless of how it comes across racial or socioeconomic lines. So when we understand equity, equity is always on the table. It's always on the table because that takes me to the obstacles. I think it's one grand obstacle, and I say this in our district a lot. We have to understand that over 92% of the students that we serve in my particular district are in a system that was not built for them. In fact, some might even argue that it was built against them. And so when you understand that, you have to know that equity has to be a part of just about every conversation, every action, every initiative, everything that you bring forth to make a difference and have a positive impact on students. You have to have equity in there, because you know that there are aspects of whatever it is systemically that work against our students. And so what we need to do is have an understanding that equity really helps us to create the types of environments. I created an acronym because we don't have enough in education, but called SWAVI. We need to create environments that are safe, welcoming, affirming, validating, and inclusive. And when we do that—
Say that again, Mr. Luke. Get that suave. Say that one more time.
We need to create environments that students feel safe, welcomed, affirmed, validated, and included. And when we do that, then we really minimize the affect, and learning can happen at optimal levels. So from a district standpoint, there are many different factors that play into that, but you have to really focus in on those aspects. And the last part is that I answered in question. In the question and answer part, we have to address mindset. There are a lot of people in our organizations that have a mindset that is not conducive to supporting certain students in our systems. And we have to address that.
Wow, suave. I love that. So I'm gonna circle back to you momentarily, Mr. Luke, because I hear some folks wanting to hear what that looks like in practice, but you're so spot on about mindset. I want to go now to the ultimate expert. And I think this is who we need to be listening to the most. Us old folks, we can talk all day, but we're not in it every single day. We're not the ones who are living it. So Ms. Kai Ward, 10th grade student, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. How you doing, Kai?
I'm doing good.
Thank you for joining us. How you
You're
feeling?
welcome. Thank you. I'm great.
So I'm gonna ask you the same question I asked the other panelists. What does equity
Okay.
mean to you? And what do you see as obstacles that get in the way of us achieving it?
So to me, equity in schools is actually similar to what you said, Dr. Howard. I feel sometimes equality and equity are like mixed together. And I think that like equality, it would be giving the same resources to all types of students. But we know that they may not work because there are a lot of students that are already at a higher level, and then we have a lot of students that are here. Giving the same resources will only put them higher and put certain students here. So I think equity would be giving the adequate amount of resources to match the needs of all students. And like Ms. Anderson said, it could be any type of resources, whether even if we're talking about like school funding, a lot of private schools and public schools, private schools are given way more resources, programs, organizations that have set them up to achieve and succeed. And I feel as though in public schools, we don't have a lot of those programs because we are underfunded. So even if that means that some schools may not get as much, there are a lot of schools that need a lot of work put into them. So I think that equity means, to me personally as well, that I wouldn't see another student and say, oh, they're set up to achieve while we're sitting here and set up to fail in the system that, like you said, isn't made for us. But I think that equity means that we get the adequate amount of resources to achieve, and not to just elevate us, but to put us at the same level so that everybody can get their, can use it in their adult life to graduate and succeed in schools. And I think that some obstacles that add to this would be a deeply rooted prejudice and racism in the decision makers and the higher power. And I also think there is a lack of representation of the smaller groups of students that are being put through these hardships and challenges in schools. I feel as though, like, it's most likely a lot of people that make the decisions about what schools get and what they need that feel as though these certain groups of students shouldn't get this, but it only should be given to the superior students that they look at as better than others. So I feel like if there was a nice amount of representation for any race, ethnicity, religion, different languages of people being like things like that, that if they were decision makers for these different schools, they could add to the influence and influence the opinion to students getting all they want. So I think the main issue with that is the people that are in charge will do anything to only see a certain group of students succeed while others are kept at the same spot and not given what they need to reach their fullest potential.
Man, that was a mic drop moment right there, Kai. Come on now. That's a future educator right there. Come on. That was phenomenal. That was outstanding.
Thank you.
That was spot on. Come on now. Man. Woo. I don't know how we expect y'all to follow up. Somebody teaching you well out there, Miss Kai.
Ms. Anderson.
Miss Anderson. Come on now. So okay. So look, let's go down. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. Miss Anderson. So there are folks who will say, okay, but what does it look like in real time? I walk into your classroom. What do I see? What do I feel? What do I hear? How do you set up your classroom? How do you cultivate those relationships? What does it mean in real time for you as a practitioner?
Well, I firmly believe that children should see themselves in their educational spaces. They should see themselves on the walls. They should see themselves in the literature. They should see themselves in the topics that you discuss. I don't believe that children should come into a dead space. Every day I have played music for my young people coming in because I want my learning environment to be alive. I want it to be comfortable. When you come into my space, it doesn't look like a regular classroom. And that's on purpose. That's intentional because I want them to come into a clean space. I want them to come into a space like, oh, this look like this could be in somebody's apartment. Absolutely. Because I want them to feel like when they come to my room that they're coming home, that it's safe in this space, that is love in this space, and that there are high expectations in this space. A lot of time in educational spaces, our children are being subject to the bigotry of low expectations. So it's like, oh, you poor thing, or oh, you're probably dealing with X, Y, and Z because you live on this block in this neighborhood, or you're this color, or whatever. So I'm not really going to challenge you because I want you to succeed, and that's not helping young people. So my expectations are very high. Another thing in my space is that I create the curriculums that I teach because I want them to be relevant to the lived experiences of my children. And that's important. I need my children to see their positionality in the world so that they can then engage the world. The whole process of my room is liberatory education because we want to tear down those things that do not recognize our humanity. But we don't want to tear them down and just be yelling at the top of our lungs and speaking nonsense. No, we're going to study to show ourselves approved, right? To then go out and come up with solutions to this thing that is denying us our humanity, this inequity exists.
But I want to pick up on this, Miss Anderson, because part of what I want you to really drive home is that folks will hear what you just said and assume that what you're doing is not standards based. I've walked into your classroom; it's still standards based. There's still
Okay.
lots of rigor. Talk through how this doesn't have to happen at the expense of being rigorous and standards based.
So my 10th grade students, like I said, we're critiquing the education of Black people in America. We started off the year just doing some overall conversation about from Black scholars about education, what it is, what it should do. Then we moved on to Du Bois and his 10 critiques, the education of Black people, his 10 critiques on education. So we're getting this historical look at Du Bois's conversation about education in America concerning Black people coming out of the enslavement process, how Black people began to create schools, and all of the conversations that were happening at that time. So like Booker T. Washington and him, right? And then we moved on to studying Bettina Love's book. We want to do more than just survive. We want to have this contemporary conversation. And then my students did comparative analysis with Du Bois in his conversation and Love and her conversation. I stalked Dr. Love over the summer before I even met my students because I'm intentional about what I'm doing, and asked her to come to my class, stalked her relentlessly. And she came on Zoom and then came in person because she had to see the students for herself. Children in my class created their own schools. They wrote vision and mission statements, and they had to, anything they had in their school, the class, the environment, the extracurriculars, all had to be supported by the scholars that we studied. So that became their textual evidence to validate the existence of that thing in their schools. And then they created computer generated recreations of their schools and presented them. So none of the things that my students have read this year or any time that I teach is standard high school literature. They're reading graduate study books, college level literature, and they're writing analysis, 5-page analysis, not paragraph. And they're doing all the things so that they can then have these conversations. Like you heard Kai. This is the product. Kai is the product of what is happening in my classroom.
So Kai, talk about it. What is it like being in Miss Anderson's classroom?
I would say personally, it is a very caring and loving environment. And I also love that, like she said, her curriculum is a reflection of us. Sometimes in, a lot of classes, we're talking about past history, and it starts to become repetitive and kind of boring, because it doesn't relate to us. But Miss Anderson, she makes you feel like you're at home, and it's a very safe environment to where we can express what we really feel. We have our book talks and our discussions that they're supposed to be 20 minutes, but sometimes they last up the whole hour of class because everybody just feels that we can put our 2 cents in. It's a safe space. And she makes you, feel very safe with her personally. You can come to her about anything. You can talk to her about anything. She's a very good teacher. And her work, it definitely, like she said, the 5-page papers, I've never done that before until I got to her class, but it actually has helped me with my writing and even how, the whole discussion on liberatory education and quality education is giving me a different viewpoint and actually inspecting the education system. And it definitely made me look at the flaws that I've never really of course, we all know about the racism and things like that. But in her class, I feel like I've definitely grown more to understand and realize that we need to have a change. And I appreciate that her class has done that for me because it makes me feel more in tune with the current things that are happening in the world, and making me feel as if it, relates to me and I can also do something about it. Because like she said, we're all coming up with our own definitions of quality education. Usually this would be something that she would just give us. But instead, as a class, when we're coming up with it together, it definitely makes me feel connected to everything that's happening and making me feel that I could also make a change.
Mm, mm, mm. So Mr. Luke, where you sit, you talked about mindsets. how do you as an administrator try to check mindsets that get in the way of allowing to happen what we hear Kai and Ms. Anderson talking about? What's your biggest frustration as an administrator when it comes to policies and or mindsets around creating more equitable schools?
So that's a great question. First thing I want to do though is I want to make sure I say it in African proverb. They ask the question of how are the children? And the response should be the children are well. And based on what this product that, I don't want to say product, let me take that away. The work that Ms. Anderson is doing, listening to our young sister Kai, I'm happy to say the children are well, because that helps me understand that our future, we have a bright future because of children like Kai. So thank you both for the work that you do. So to that question, I mentioned mindset, but you have on a district level, you have to provide opportunities for your staff to be able to build capacity in this area in equitable fact, and in the area of understanding culture, understanding the building these environments, the sense of belonging and things like that. So one of the challenges that I know that we have is that you have these systems that are in place. Sometimes it can be union, sometimes it can be administration, district level administration or site administration. So and it can be kind of the ways that they move. It can be budget. It can be prioritization as far as how you spend your money. So what we have to do is really, from an equitable standpoint, engage in things like equity audits and look at how your organization is functioning when it comes to infusing or centering really equity in everything you do. For example, I mentioned mindset in our district. One thing that I want to be able to build, and that we're in the process of building in our district, is I have what's called an Equity Academy. The Equity Academy is really just classes. And this year I've taught 2 classes. I taught race and culture. I've taught institutional racism. Now these classes are voluntary, and you have a finite number of people that can attend these types of classes. But what I hope to do and what I plan to do is get it to the point where these classes with particular titles are repetitive classes and things like that, where not only the people can come and volunteer, where you get the committee of the willing, but then you can also get to the point from an administrative standpoint, because sometimes you have to be administrative, and you can really direct people to attend classes like that to get information at the very least, right? I know you can't force people to shift their thought processes and things like that, but we have to, I'm a systems person, and we have to understand the first thing is that we function inside of a system that is centered in white supremacy. You said it earlier, Dr. Howard, right? And when we do that, after you get past of all your emotions and things like that, and you're like, oh my goodness, he said that, and he's talking like that, then you have to sit in the reality and say, okay, is that an accurate statement? And then you start going like the young people say, you start pulling out these receipts. Now, when you do that, okay, now we build systems, we try to rebuild systems or build other systems that help us to understand that perspective, understand that in which we work in, and then we have to actually make a commitment. And this is all based on equity, a commitment to be an agent inside of a system that has not been built for students of color. When you make that commitment to be an agent like that, you should have an antenna that's up where you're listening to language, you're looking at practices, you're looking and listening to behavior, and you're willing and bold enough to address it, to confront it, to say, look, because really fundamentally, people are not bad. People are socially engineered certain ways. And when you bring people's attention to certain things, then for the most part, you're going to have people with a willingness to say, maybe let me learn, especially educators, let me learn a little more about this. Let me grow my capacity since I'm going to be a lifelong learner. And you have to get these bold spaces. I'm not looking for safe spaces. I'm looking for bold spaces for people to be willing to be challenged. People are willing to learn more, to address things that they're not sure about. And when they think things are not right, say something.
Yep. Wow. Okay. So we got some questions coming through. Thank you all for kind of engaging me. I could ask questions all hour long, but we have limited time. Geneva, you want to pull a couple of questions here and make sure we get some engagement from folks who are on line with us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I know some of them have been kind of answered throughout, but there was a question for Mr. Luke about kind of what SWAVI can look like in practice and any results of that point to evidence of impact from that.
I think Miss Anderson answered that.
Okay.
It looks like the classroom that she described. It looks like home. That was the thing that I locked onto that. These environments that we create, and we're in charge of creating our environments. The environments that we create should be spaces where our children are not dreading to come to, but they're looking forward to come to. You hear it in Sister Kai's voice. You hear how she saying, I'm happy to come to school. She even talked about the thing that students dread, writing papers. And she hadn't done it before. But now she understands the benefit of it and how it gets her to another space of learning. And because that's the environment. So when I use that acronym of SWAVI, it's really focused in on the environment, because our environments in public education too many times have been environments that are not built for a large number of our students. So we have to be intentional. I heard that said earlier too. We have to be intentional in how we create these environments where our students come in and they're like, okay, I love coming in here, because children are satellites and they pick up everything, right? When you have a kindergartner say, I don't like that teacher because that teacher doesn't like me, that child may not be able to articulate it. But if you peel back the onion a bit and you start observing, then you'll see some things possibly coming out, right? So we have to listen and understand our children, at the same time build these environments where they feel like home, as Ms. Anderson said.
Well said. Thank you for that, Mr. Luke.
Dr. Howard, there's a question about the relationships that schools can develop with community-based organizations and how that can be a factor in creating more equitable schools. Does the book touch on this at all, or do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it does. And chapter 3, I lift up community schools as a model, right? And one of the key parts that has to be in place for community schools to be exemplary, schools cannot just sit and wait to see who will want to come partner with us. Schools have to be deliberate in saying, look, if there's a community organization down the street that offers after-school tutoring, how do we find ways to link with them where they've got the resource and the people, we've got the students? It's a win-win situation, right? I see schools now doing a much better job of bringing those supports and services. I was at a school just a few weeks ago. They have a chess club there. Why? Because they saw the chess club at the YMCA, which was a couple blocks away, right? Part of the issue becomes, how do we begin to recognize that how do some students, and I see this all the time, there are programs at schools, after school programs. Students will miss school for the entire day, but come for the after school program because the after school program does something for them that school does not do for them. That's a data point. The data point says that whatever the community-based organization program is offering on the school site is enough for that student to say, I'm willing to get up and get dressed and go to school, not for the 6 periods throughout the day, but because they have, at one school I saw in Texas, a cosmetology program that a teacher was putting on her own, where she was incorporating science and math elements to it. Those are the things that schools have to be intentional about. You have to do asset mapping of your community, know what resources exist, what community-based orgs are there, what nonprofits are there, because they're in more of our communities than we recognize. I maintain, ask the students, they can tell you where to go, because oftentimes the students access these places. Go to your local mosque, go to your local churches, because they have these same kinds of resources there that are looking for young people, and yet schools are saying we don't know how to find these different kinds of resources. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything on that one.
I just throw in, we have to connect with our communities. We have to connect with our communities. I mean, in my doctoral work, I'm using a framework from YOSO around community cultural wealth. And we have to look at what assets are in our communities that our students glean from every day. And we don't look at them like as assets, but their social capital that they have, there's familial capital that they have. I mean, there's all these different abilities or capitals that are available to them that they utilize every day. And when we tap in as educators, when we tap into that, then we can look at our students from a standpoint of having these assets when they walk through the door. And it helps shift a deficit-minded perspective, because all the stuff that you may see in the news on cops or something like that. But then when you really understand that your students come to your class as developed human beings with a lot of skills and abilities, and it's on you as an educator to really start looking in their environments and saying, oh, you have these skills because you're able to maneuver through this. And then you tap into that and attach that to the learning that happens in school.
And can I add one more thing?
Please do.
Connected. One thing with teachers, you have to be intentional about your moves in your classroom. The other part of it is you have to take the learning that's happening in your class out of your class. A lot of times teachers get into, this is my own little island, this is my own little world, and my students have this work, and we're just going to talk to each other. You have to empower young people to be like, listen, we've taken it to the lab, we have created this product. You have to empower young people to say, now take this voice and take it out. But we have to be intentional about creating those opportunities. So your instruction, the things that these young people are producing with their brilliant minds, have to come out your classroom to the larger community, which could be the school community, right? And then taking it higher than that. Who are the decision makers that are connected to this thing you've been studying? Are you studying something that decision makers are involved in, right? And then get an audience in front of them and let these young people see your voice is powerful. What you're saying, what you've learned, what you have expressed, what you're thinking is important. But we have to be intentional as educators to create these opportunities for young people.
Well said. I'm looking at our time. We're getting close. We can pull one more question from someone, Janine, before I let these folks go around one more time with comments.
Sure. Yeah. So there was a question about certain issues being kind of symptomatic of more systemic issues. So somebody brought up like use of the N-word. You know, of course you can address kind of that incident, but then can you go deeper to address that is symptomatic of something deeper? Whoever wants to jump in.
How does the N-word get addressed? I'm curious. I hear that at every school I go to now. Every school.
I just need clarification.
So when the N-word is used, what is your response as an educator?
Who's saying it?
Students.
Which ones? So that's what I mean. Like, who's saying it? Like, we had this conversation in my 11th grade class because we're studying English by examining hip hop and its role in social movements, right?
Yes.
And so Dr. Boyd has this conversation about the N-word, whether it's an A on the N or an ER. And the fact that, you know, there's been conversations in the hip hop realm that hip hop has allowed Black people to take ownership now of that word and use it, right? Instead of it being derogatory in a sense, but taking it back, taking it away, not back, but just taking it away, right? So that's why I was like, well, who's using it? And in what context is this thing happening?
Yeah. I hear a lot of non-Black students using the N-word, or they get an N-word pass. And I think a lot of Black students who are not at predominantly Black schools take exception to that. And that's something that I hear a lot of folks say, especially white educators who say, well, I don't feel it's my place to tell people how they should or should not use the N-word. So again, I'm just curious as to how you all deal with this when you hear it and see it.
I'm an old head, and we need to get rid of it. There's so much more to that, and I know we don't have enough time because in our community, it's been created this term of endearment almost, but I'm one to say that's part of, and I'm frank, so I'll say it's part of a psychosis that's been put upon us, where we try to take something and make it right for us, in all in the spirit of trying to take it back or take control of it or something like that, as opposed to being able to say, okay, we'll do away with this, and you don't use it, we won't use it, nobody uses it, and it's a problem.
Yeah.
But I'm an old head.
Yeah,
but
we're gonna have another webinar just on this topic because I think it's that robust. We got 4 minutes. I want each of y'all to go around. Just give me 30, 45 seconds max about sort of what you want folks to know about how you think about equity, what equity means to you, and then how folks can find you. Not you, Kai, because we're gonna protect you, young lady, but for the grown folks on here.
I'll start. My spiel is that every educator needs to know, understand, accept that the destiny of that child that's sitting in front of you in that classroom is linked to your destiny. And you need to teach that child like you would teach someone you would die for, because they are going to inherit the world that you will be old in. So your destiny is linked to them. And so when it's their turn at bat, what did you pour into them that can be manifested when it's time for them to make decisions?
Ms. Anderson, how can folks find you if they want to follow up? Because you're going to have a lot of questions and queries about how you do what you do.
Well, my email is njanderson@slabeber.org. Beber is BEEBER. So it's njanderson@slabeber.org.
Mr. Luke, what you got for us?
So I think, quickly, my view is for educators. How do you view students of color? And since my department is access and equity for African-American student achievement, how do you view Black children? Do you view them as what you see on cops? Do you view them as what you see in the news? Do you view them as what you see in some of these stereotypical movies and TV shows? Or do you view them as the thing that is factual? Because all that other stuff is not factual. Do you view them as descendants of the original human beings on this planet? Do you view them as the descendants of the people that created civilization for humanity? That is a huge difference. And I pose that question, and you can pose it with our indigenous population, our Latinx population, because the way that we look at our students and the thoughts that we have matter. So when you shift it and understand the greatness and the humanity that this child presents towards you, then it should change the way you behave.
That's right. How can folks find you, Mr. Luke?
I give my personal
Can you drop it in the chat for us? Can you drop it in the chat for us, please?
Yeah.
Sure. Ms. Kai Ward, why don't you bless us with some of your wisdom before we close this out? What you got for us? Any thoughts?
I just think as a student that every student of any race, any ethnicity, religion should all feel included and loved and cared for and appreciated in their educational environment. And I think that cultural relevancy is important amongst all educators to make sure that the students feel as if, they're home and they're safe and they can talk to the teachers and they can talk to their peers, and that their work is appreciated and that all students are given what they need, the correct resources, the adequate amount of resources that will help them carry it on to their adult lives, achieve their goals, and help them reach their fullest potentials.
Wow. Thank you so much. Kai, you are destined for some tremendous success. Just keep being brilliant, keep being amazing. Don't let anybody steal your thunder and your joy. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Thank you, Mr. Luke. Thank everyone who joined us today. I want to shout out again, thank you, Geneva and Caitlin, for setting us up for the webinar. Please go out and buy the book. I think a lot of the issues we discussed here, you'll find in the book. There is all the information on how you can get the book. Get you 20% off if you go through Corwin and use the link that you see there. Folks, we got a lot of work to do. 7-year anniversary is coming up in 2 days. Let's reflect on where we've been. Let's reflect on where we are. but most importantly, let's reflect on where we can go moving forward. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, and keep up the work that you are doing, and let's be better at what we do. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.